that the election was stolen and that Mr Trump will win a second term. The rally is 1 week since the election was called for Joe Biden and takes place as the US continues to shatter COVID-19 infection records. People chanting "Stop the Steal" gathered at Freedom Plaza near the White House, few of them wearing masks. Correspondent Greg Jennett has more from the streets of Washington, D.C.
We're on Constitution Avenue, and as you might see behind me, people are flocking down the hill. Up that hill, in fact, is the Supreme Court of the United States of America, and then out to the other side of me on Constitution Avenue is the Congress there on Capitol Hill. And it's around those institutions of American democracy that thousands, let's make that hundreds of thousands of Trump supporters have snaked their way, starting first of all down this end of the street. That's Freedom Plaza down here, and that's where many are heading back right now. That is within 100 to 200 metres of the White House. So, as you can imagine, they've left there, they've come up here, around the court, around the Capitol, and they're going back. It has been remarkably peaceful, but also for a city of this size, and bearing in mind that there's only been about a week to organise this grouping, which was originally called the Million MAGA March, meaning 1 million people was aimed for to make America great again, to use Donald Trump's phrase. They didn't get 1 million, no way, but they've certainly got in the hundreds of thousands, and they've come from far and wide. We've spoken to people here who are all of exactly the same view that Donald Trump was the rightful winner of the November 3 election, and they've come from states down in Texas, over in Oregon, on the West Coast, to make that point right here on Constitution Avenue.
We want him in there for 4 more years, and we see that the Democrats and the Liberals are basically trying to steal the election through fraud, and we're not going to stand for it.
I believe that through the proof of our court system that Trump will be reelected.
There is a lot of energy within the country now to correct this, and I hope that we correct this the proper way through the system, because I don't want to see what this becomes if the theft continues.
He will win! He will win! Woo!
Donald Trump, to the extent that he is fighting this, is fighting the fight with the thumbs on the iPhone. That's where his comments are most strident every day, tweeting about this election being rigged. He hasn't said that much. Indeed, casting back to that event in the Rose Garden yesterday, there was almost the subtle outline of an acknowledgement that he may not be around in February when this vaccine, if it comes to pass, is going to be rolled out nationally. But you ask, what do the people here think? Well, to a person, those who we've spoken to believe that this can yet be won, that media pundits who look at the numbers and make these calls, giving states away and getting Joe Biden to 270 electoral college votes plus, that they're simply wrong, and these numbers are going to be mowed down by reality as days and weeks pass in the official counts and the certification that follows through December and through January. Or their belief is that if that weren't to happen, then it might ultimately be settled in their favour in the US Supreme Court just up the road. That might sound like a long shot to a lot of people. Indeed, the 75 million people who voted for Joe Biden in this country. But as much as these people represent the 72 million who voted for Donald Trump, this is their fervent hope and belief. Striking here is the fact that you're probably only talking about 40% mask wearing in this crowd. And if we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, that's large numbers of unmasked people. As I say, we reckon we're pretty safe with this area. We've cleared ourselves here. But just imagine the logistics in making it here. Some of the people we heard from just a little earlier in this broadcast have told us they've caught planes from states far and wide in this vast land. Some of those states are tremendously infected with record rates each and every day. So they've had to get on planes, get in cabs, buses, whatever the logistics of their arrangements to make it to this capital. You'd have to imagine that presents risks to fellow travellers and potentially also to the residents of this city. Although I do add that not many of them, being predominantly Democrat supporters, seem to have come out. Certainly we haven't met many residents of DC. Most seem to have come in from interstate.
Counter-protesters have gathered at Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington in response to the large rally of Trump supporters in the city. Chief Foreign Correspondent Phil Williams witnessed clashes between the opposing groups of protesters.
There's a man who's just been attacked. You can see he's been bloodied. You can see he's shaking. And you've got a pretty ugly scene here of people attacking him. I saw someone kicking him. And he's being taken now into an area where he's probably safer. We haven't seen any police intervening here. Mate, you should... That's a sense of the ugliness. This is the first ugliness I've seen. This guy is really not in fabulous shape. He's really quite nastily attacked and hurt. So, yeah. So look, that's the situation we have right here. It's not pretty, but these are the sorts of tensions that are evolving here. And as the night wears on, you may see a little bit more of this. But it was one of those, very ugly mob moments where you have a few vulnerable people. Yes, they're not the sort of people that they are welcome in this particular area. But amidst that particular tension, the mob just piled in and kicked this guy literally while he was down. What the police have been doing is clearing people out of 16th Street, Black Lives Plaza, which is a flashpoint because there were Trump people entering it. It is seen as the centre of an anti-Trump movement, and they were not being welcomed. So they basically tossed pretty much as people came out, they weren't allowed back in. So they're now out, loose on the streets. And so are the Trump supporters. It's turning a bit ugly.
Returning home, the Victorian government will spend $5.3 billion on social housing over the next 4 years, building more than 12,000 public housing homes. Construction will start immediately on what is being described as the largest ever investment by a state government in public housing across the country. The project will create an estimated 43,000 jobs.
This is all about securing livelihoods, many jobs, and giving that construction industry the certainty that they need after a very challenging year. Of course, they're not jobs for their own sake. Each of those 10,000 workers a year for each of the next 4 years, with the certainty of that pipeline of work, can spend, can invest. That's all about creating economic activity and economic benefit for every single Victorian.
Emma King is the Chief Executive of the Victorian Council of Social Service and says it's a very welcome move.
We're thrilled. This is an unprecedented investment without question. We're seeing 12,000 new homes being built for Victorians in social housing in a way that, we've never seen before. It is genuinely unprecedented. And it's also on top of our state budget. Our state government at the last election also promised 1,000 public housing homes to be constructed. So this announcement is on top of that. It is an unprecedented investment, and it's a great combination of building homes for people who desperately need them, but also job creation as well. So it's a great day. The reality is we've had people who, women escaping family violence who are sleeping in cars. We've had actually up into the pandemic, we've had people who are literally sleeping on the street. We've got overcrowded accommodation, etc. One of the interesting things that the pandemic showed was that we can tackle this in a way that perhaps we'd always been told that we couldn't.
The Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt, wants legislation to create an Indigenous voice to Parliament to pass before the next election. The Coalition has faced criticism for ruling out enshrining an Indigenous voice in the Constitution, something the Uluru Statement from the Heart recommended in 2017. Speaking on Insiders, Mr Wyatt said there were issues around representation, while Shadow Minister Linda Burney says Labor fully backs the Uluru Statement.
There wasn't a concern in respect to having a voice to government or to Parliament. It was about the way the voice was not defined in that statement. And the consultation process that I've established, the response from community about having local voices heard to address their issues has been the most predominant element of the work that is being done by the regional and local voice committees that I established.
Labor endorses and accepts in full what Uluru has said, and that's really important in this discussion, David, is that we don't just focus on the voice. I mean, that's crucial, but we focus on what Uluru actually said. It said we want an enshrined voice in the Constitution. We want a Makarrata Commission that would oversee agreement and treaty making and oversee a national process of truth-telling.
The Health Minister, Greg Hunt, says he doesn't expect it will be necessary to make a coronavirus vaccine compulsory, as Australians are already mostly compliant with vaccination programs. Mr Hunt says options exist to boost vaccine take-up if it's too low, but he doesn't expect that will be the case.
Certainly going to be voluntary. We, at this stage, haven't made any decisions. What we've seen is that Australians are extraordinary vaccinators. One of the big surprises of this year is that even through the lockdowns, whether it was through the first wave or through the Victorian lockdown, we've had an increase in 5-year-old vaccination rates to record levels, and I would not have expected that. We went to 94.8% in the June quarter and then to 4.9% in the June quarter for national 5-year-olds and to 97% for Indigenous 5-year-olds. And so that's coupled with the fact that we've gone from 8 to 11 to 13 to 17 million flu vaccines. So we're expecting very wide take-up. There are always options which have been reserved, but at this stage I'm not anticipating that they'll be drawn upon. Vaccination practices and policies will continue to be guided by the medical experts, and I think that's been the hallmark of what we've done in Australia over the last year. We've been fortunate to have very, very significant success by global standards, but with, of course, losses and tragedy along the way, which can never be minimised. But we've followed the medical advice and will continue to follow the medical advice. The Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation leads that process in guiding the terms and the circumstances for vaccination, and where they believe that additional actions are required, then historically we've always followed that.
South Australia is facing dangerous fire conditions today, with total fire bans in place across much of the state. The Country Fire Service says a mix of high temperatures, damaging winds and lightning strikes could make firefighting difficult. Authorities are urging people to take early precautions and to look at their bushfire safety plans.
So we've got the general wind flow, we've got the thunderstorms, we've got the lightning, all coming together to result in very dangerous fire conditions across large parts of the state.
We don't want people to underplay the risk in those severe areas, just because there's other areas that are at extreme. Severe is still dangerous fire weather conditions that have the potential to produce fires that could threaten your safety.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has cancelled a trip to Papua New Guinea as the country prepares for weeks of political uncertainty. PNG's Prime Minister, James Marape, is at risk of being ousted after a mass walkout of MPs from his ruling coalition. Peter Jennings, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, expands on what this means for the more than $550 million the Australian government has pledged for the region.
Unfortunate, of course, that Scott Morrison found himself planning to arrive just as there is a serious challenge to James Marape's leadership in Papua New Guinea. That's kind of situation normal as far as PNG politics is concerned. And of course, the important thing for Australia is whoever is Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, we need to have a good relationship with that administration. So yes, I think that there is going to be continuity. I think the debt rollover will happen. I understand also there was going to be an Australian financial bailing out of a number of Pacific Islands airlines, which are critical to how these islands are able to maintain contact with the world. We will see more of this. There is no question that China is becoming increasingly competitive. It's into the Pacific Island countries with money, politics, buying influence. It's very hard for Australia to compete with that. But Papua New Guinea is strategically crucial to us, just as it was in the Second World War. Geography hasn't changed. And so therefore, I think we will, continue to see high levels of Australian interest. And I'm sure Scott Morrison will be planning to get up there as soon as is practical given the state of PNG politics today. Well, in many ways, that is a disguised conversation about China, because if you talk about shared values and you talk about the supporting the international rule of law, in effect, you are saying that you are not supporting how China is operating in the South China Sea or against Taiwan, or indeed being more aggressive and assertive to almost all of its neighbours. And I think what Scott Morrison is doing is, in a very considered and calculated way, he is trying to shape how the Biden administration will approach the Indo-Pacific. We want the United States to be talking to its allies. That's something that we haven't had as much of as we would like, frankly, in the last 4 years. And I think it's also very significant that Morrison, told Australians and reminded Biden that, Biden had two uncles, one of whom fought and died in Papua New Guinea, the other fought in Papua New Guinea. So Biden has direct personal connections. It's these types of linkages that I think can become really important in terms of how we engage the US. And of course, Morrison invited Biden to come to Australia for the 70th anniversary of the signing of the ANZUS Treaty, which happens in September next year. So these are building connections. It's not just exchanging pleasantries.
In Peru, dozens of people have been injured in clashes between police and protesters. Supporters of the ousted President Martin Vizcarra have taken to the streets each night since the Peruvian Congress voted to impeach him on allegations of corruption during his time as governor. Some of the demonstrations have turned violent, with protesters throwing rocks at police and damaging businesses. Witnesses said police used tear gas and rubber bullets on protesters, injuring at least 27 people. This is the scene now, live in Peru's capital, Lima. We can see there those clashes are continuing on the streets into the night. Local time there now is just after 8 p.m. You can hear the sound of people there still protesting. We've also seen tear gas and other objects being thrown. We'll keep you updated on this story as it develops. The conflict in Ethiopia is worsening, with at least 17,000 people crossing into Sudan after fleeing fighting in the northern Tigray region. Tigray forces fired rockets into neighbouring Amhara region, targeting 2 airports. It follows reports of soldiers massacring civilians this week. The UN says refugees are arriving in Sudan on foot in extremely remote areas. Melburnians are flocking to regional Victoria this weekend after the so-called Ring of Steel border was lifted. Many people are enjoying their first out-of-town getaway in months. Steve Rowe, the Chief Executive of Daylesford Macedon Tourism, says it's bringing some much-needed business to the regions.
The second lockdown was by far the hardest. I mean, mainly because, the first lockdown was tough. But what happened is, in June, people started to open up again, restaff, restock and things like that. And then to have that second whack, it really, at an emotional level, really knocked people around. And then, of course, on a sort of business level, it really had a huge impact on people's bottom line. And had things not started to ease up in terms of restrictions when they did, I think we would have seen quite a few businesses going under. We're pretty fortunate in respect to international travel because it only accounts for about 10% of our visitation. So I think the sort of net effect for the Daylesford and Macedon Ranges region is positive with closed borders. If people can't go overseas, they will go somewhere else. And the offer that we have, with things like great nature-based experiences, great food and wine, little villages, sort of pampering and wellness experiences, that's what people, particularly in Melbourne, who've been locked down, are looking for. So we're expecting those closures to actually benefit us ultimately. Look, it's been brutal. It's the only way to describe it. I mean, we're talking with operators every day who are in tears, and businesses that have been around for 30 years were looking potentially like they would go under. So that was stressful. And as a regional tourism board, what we do is we both market the region, we support operators, and we sort of develop product. And we obviously switched to almost 90% of our effort was into supporting operators and getting them through this really tough time. And now we're sort of moving back into that more enjoyable marketing side of the business. Look, we're in the Central Highlands. We're about an hour or so from Melbourne. And the Melbourne market is what we rely on. And as I was saying earlier, it's we've got these beautiful old gold rush villages. Our region is known for wellness, and that's related to the mineral springs. We've got 80% of the mineral springs of Australia in our region, and that led to this sort of spa culture here. And those mineral springs create some beautiful produce. So we've got some of the best produce in Australia, so whether it's food or wine or whatever. And a lot of the restaurants in the area use predominantly local produce, so people often come here as well for a great food and wine experience.
Time now for sport with Louise Ransom.